Alright, the next R, obviously, we've talked about refer back, we've talked about refute, right? So refuting, explaining why your arguments are better than theirs on a particular issue. And lastly is read more. And reading more comes down to a couple things. First, is it an important issue? If it's an extremely important issue, you're going to want to read more, right? So there are certain issues in the debate that you have to win in order to win the debate, right? So solvency is always usually a big one. You have to win that your AF is able to solve. If you do not win that argument, you're going to lose the debate, right? So sometimes you want to read more pieces of evidence, like another piece of evidence that says something or fills in the gap to the warrant you've already had. So this is kind of making the same argument, but it's nuanced a little bit differently, and therefore kind of fills in the gap. Does that kind of make sense? So there might be something missing from your original 1AC piece of evidence, but it's still really good, but there's something a little bit kind of missing from it, so you might add another piece of evidence that says something similar to prove that it's true, okay? That would be an instance where you would read more. A second instance is if it directly answers something. So that's another great opportunity to read more, right? So let's say you're having a warming debate, and they've read a alternate causality, China releases a bunch of emissions, right? Well, you can still extend your piece of evidence that's like the United States is the biggest contributor to greenhouse gases, and we have to get rid of our coal reliance. If we don't get rid of our coal reliance, everything else is irrelevant, right? You can make those arguments to China, on the China argument, but that doesn't directly refute it, right? So, but we do have evidence that indicates that if we made it cheap enough, China would buy into our nuclear power plants immediately and shift from coal and all sorts of fossil fuels to nuclear power. So that would directly answer the argument they're making. So that's another instance in which you could read more pieces of evidence. And the last one is, do you need more warrants? Do you need a diversity of warrants? And I think politics is probably the best example of this. So, when you are extending your link turn in the 1AR on politics, it is productive to read another card that says the exact same thing that the 2AC evidence said on the non-unique. You with me so far? But you don't want to read more than two, because you have two pieces of evidence that say the same thing, kind of filled in a little gap, right? What you want to do is read evidence that directly answers their uniqueness pieces of evidence. So they might read a piece of evidence in the 2NC that talks about a specific senator going one way or the other on immigration reform. Well, you might have an answer to that that's like, that will directly answer that with a piece of evidence that's either like, that senator's not important, or that senator's already changed their mind already, right? Something like that. That would directly answer it. Or, in a big link turn debate, you're going to want to have a diversity of warrants. So, not only is like the 2AC evidence that talks about vote count go our way on immigration reform, but also, you know, Boehner jumped on board, that means everyone else is going to fall in line. Or, you know, Republicans will cave on this question because they need to get immigrants or minority votes in the midterm elections, right? Those are all different warrants as to why immigration reform would be passed right now. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah.
And so you want to be able to diversify the number of warrants you have as to why something might be occurring, especially when it's like a particularly big issue. That's the same reason why negative teams will read a whole bunch of different cards about how India is causing a bunch of CO2 emissions, the EU is causing a bunch of CO2 emissions, China is causing a bunch of emissions, the construction industry in the United States, the manufacturing industry in the United States, and they'll try to put a bunch of different things that you can't solve for with your AF to try to prove you can't solve for warming. And that what they're doing is they're diversifying their warrants so that it makes it harder for you to answer, because you have to refute all of those things. Alright, so now that we've talked about read more, we've looked at how you have to refer back. You extend a piece of evidence on a controversial issue. You'll refute the arguments, and specifically the warrants, that the other team is using. You'll explain why your arguments respond to the warrants that they are using. For example, if they said, China causes a bunch of emissions to occur, means you can't solve warming, you could say, but our technology or our way of solving warming spills over to China. That's a direct refutation from it. And lastly, you'll read more. And there's several different instances we talked about. Is it a super important issue that you need to make sure that the original warrant you had is rock solid? You might read another piece of evidence. Or if it's a piece of evidence that can directly answer something that they've already read. Or lastly, if you need to have a diversity of warrants because you really need to win that argument. That's an instance in which you're going to read more. Next, we'll talk about how you compare pieces of evidence together.